Great. I think we can get started. How much time do we have? Is it an hour? And then questions? 45 minutes and then 15 for questions. Okay, well, we're going to start off by breaking that rule. We decided that we'll do the questions while we're talking to just kind of make it more interactive. So if anyone has a question, just raise your hand. Maybe jump up and down if I don't notice you, and then we'll try to take questions for whatever's relevant to the discussion. So I thought I'd just have a few opening comments. So thank you all for coming. I think it's going to be super exciting. Even just our conversation in the back room, we thought, man, we should be recording this. This is great. So it's going to be good. And we're going to be talking about the challenges and opportunities of AI in biology. And I was reflecting on this before we started. I thought, you know, a few years ago, before the rollout of, say, AlphaFold 2 and ChatGPT 3.5, I think your main challenge probably would have been getting anyone to care about this topic at all, outside of maybe some really hardcore computational biologists and maybe philosophers, who knows. But now it's like, I find it's hard to have a conversation with anyone and not talk about AI. People are really, really excited about this space for good reason. You know, you get kind of standard catchphrases thinking about AI and biology where, you know, AI is going to bring us into the biological age where we're taking what used to be an artisanal science done by teams of geniuses into kind of an engineering practice, or as Jensen Huang from NVIDIA would say, digital biology is going to be the next big technological revolution, which is followed up with there's just tons of money getting poured into this space from NVIDIA, Google, Amazon, Salesforce, so many investment funds, you name it, just billions of dollars. But at the same time, generally when that kind of cash is being funneled into a field, I tend to find there is some proportional level of hype. And I think I'd love to, if you get one thing out of today's talk, we can maybe fine-tune your own internal hyperparameters of your model for AI and biology, of what's real, what's useful, what maybe isn't, what's some bad directions not to go down. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm hoping we can get through this. And we were all kind of wondering, to get a sense of the audience as well, just through a show of hands, what kind of our distribution of people are here. So if you're kind of in the life sciences like biology or chemistry, can you raise your hands? Okay, so I don't know, maybe like 20%, 30%, something like that. How many people are your computer scientists, AI people? Okay, less even. And then I guess business, investors. Okay, about an equal amount. And then just people that are interested and not in those categories. Walk-ins from the street. All right, great. Okay, so we seem to have roughly an equal mix of everyone. And then lastly, more want to get a sense of if you're in academia, raise your hands. Grad school, okay, decent amount. And then industry. Okay, lots of industry. Great. Cool. I think now we're ready to jump into just some introductions of your amazing panelists. So first we'll start with Gwen. So Gwen Cheni, who's a trailblazer at the intersection of biology and artificial intelligence, has ventured from the heights of Wall Street to the forefront of innovative startups, graduating from Yale, doing groundbreaking research at UCSF, and has had leadership roles at Khosla Ventures and IndieBio. You've probably heard of them. Gwen's career has been one of pioneering investments in deep tech exploration, helping to shape the future of AI and biotechnology. So you can give a round of applause for Gwen. Next, we have Robert Paproski, who has seamlessly evolved from an oncologist PhD to pioneering machine learning engineer at the helm of Nanostics here in Edmonton. Driven by his passion for video games and a keen intellect for complex data, Robert is working on redefining the intersection of medicine and AI. His innovative work not only enhances diagnostic precision, but also pioneers new frontiers in medical technology, making him a leader in transforming patient care through cutting AI applications. Get a round of applause. Great. And lastly, we have Milad Alucozai, a visionary at the nexus of neuroscience and entrepreneurial innovation, who has traversed from the lab benches to translational neurosciences to the boardrooms of global VC firms. As the head of bio and deep tech at Box One Ventures, Milad has championed the fusion of AI with biology, steering nearly 80 startups from their nascent stages to IPOs and acquisitions. With his roots in neuroscientific research and a passion for mentoring budding entrepreneurs worldwide, Milad exemplifies a career that has been both scientifically rich and globally profound. Awesome. Okay, so I wanted to just kind of start off with a pretty open-ended question. So we'll just go with that. We'll start with Gwen. Can you discuss instances where you think AI has lived up to its hype or promise in biology, and conversely, an example where you think it has fallen short of expectations? And just one last piece of housekeeping. When we say biology, it can literally mean almost anything, life sciences, healthcare, you name it, whatever you want it to be, we'll kind of dive into that. Okay, great.
I'd say the one area where the slope is faster than I expected is actually sort of taking transcripts of patient care. It was stuck for a long time, but we're finally seeing adoption. And so that area I'm pretty excited about. But how it's going to link up to patient care is yet to be seen. But the transcripts are quite good now. The part where I think we still have to see that steeper slope is in drug discovery, right? So AlphaFold has been all the hype. We have now AlphaFold 3, but how many drugs has it led to, right? I think it's 0 for now. And if you look at Recursion, Schrodinger, when Recursion first launched, the goal was 100 drugs in 10 years. And I think it has 1 in the clinic and not quite approved. So we're quite behind in that. And I think there was a session today at the conference on, preclinical without a parachute. And I was definitely pushing the speakers on, where's the clinical data that we can use to train our models. And, there are many different reasons for it. There's data being siloed in different pharma, but, that's an area where I really think AI has a shot at improving our lives, but hasn't lived up quite yet.
Thanks. Robert?
That's actually a pretty interesting answer. I was going to say, I agree with you that AlphaFold does not live up to the hype in terms of some of those metrics they wanted to have, although it is interesting that AlphaFold 3 just came out this month. And they increased the accuracy of looking at the ability to look at how proteins interact with other molecules, whether it be RNA, DNA, small molecules, and the accuracy increase was 50%, which is actually quite impressive. Is it living up to the hype yet? No, but I do think it's rapidly evolving. I think it's actually really impressive. Maybe our metrics were just a little too high, what we expected from it. But I was actually quite impressed with the development. In general, what I really like about machine learning and AI is that we have a whole host of different algorithms we can use. That's not to say all the different algorithms like we have with XGBoost and deep learning with neural networks are all in the clinic yet, but one thing I really like about it is that I think it's more of a data problem than an actual algorithm problem from the AI itself. From all the work that I've done, looking at a bunch of different data sets in terms of whether it's CanPath data sets, different prostate cancer data sets from a variety of different places, different clinics. Usually, the algorithms are exceptionally good at finding patterns within the data set you're looking at. And if you do cross-validation on the specific data sets and specific clinics on themselves, you get remarkable results. So I think in general, AI with all the different algorithms are really amazing. But what we really need to have is the data sets that can look at the proper distribution of all the different types of clinical data we see across the nation and the world in order to make these AI models more useful commercially.
Great. Milad?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the most exciting things, first and foremost, it's great to be here in Edmonton. It's crazy for me in some respects as we're pondering about this question. I even have investments here that I think I see someone in the back. Yeah, I do. Yeah, there you go. Drug Bank, Future Fields, other companies I've invested in. And this is the first time I'm visiting. And every time I come out to different areas and I leave the Bay Area, it's quite fascinating to me to see rooms filled with people interested in what's going on in the AI space. And even to the earlier point of how different everybody's expertise are, this is what excites me from the AI field, because you get finally convergence of all these different disciplines. When I was studying neuroscience, we usually would separate. I did biomedical engineering and neuroscience. We separated those classes, and I was either in a classroom with engineers or I was in a classroom with scientists. And now you're in a room filled with almost every background you can possibly imagine. The thing that excites me from a healthcare perspective when I look at this, often it doesn't make the headlines, but AI has already been used in quite a bit of clinical care. Anytime you go in for blood work, anytime you go in to visit your clinician, there's some element of that, operationally, scheduling, automation, that AI is playing some role in. From the biotech perspective, the way we think about automation for lab equipment and lab studies, and some of those works are getting better and better as we think about them. There is a lot of hype, and similar to Robert and Gwen's point, some of that has fallen short. But I think the exciting point that I always try to draw from that, it has, when I was looking at doing drug development in my research career, in silico, in vivo, in vitro, they were all very separate fields. And now you're finally living at a time where the convergence of these fields is almost fluid. Traditional drug development, we've thought about it differently. And there's an element of this where I think AI is bringing a new perspective to how we think about approaching these problems. That is quite fascinating and exciting. And there is nobody running around with 30, 40 years of LLM experience these days, right? Everybody in this room is at the cutting edge of what's happening, and it gives young folks a huge opportunity to get ahead. And so what I get really excited about these days, we're at a very interesting juncture point from a geopolitical lens where you have incumbents like Microsoft and others trying to reinvent themselves. You have startups that are playing a very unique role into this. And then you have nations that are trying to figure out, should we prioritize small language models? Should we prioritize large language models? Where does Edmonton fit into this? Alberta? Where do the provinces fit? From a geopolitical perspective, are those nations that often lead in technology going to continue to do that? Or are we going to see a shift in that as well? So there is no more exciting time to be alive and to be working on problems like this. And I think bio has naturally been a neglected area because it's been really difficult, but we're starting to see more and more resources. And it's my job from the investment hat to figure out what's good and what isn't, and to differentiate the hype. And often some of my colleagues from the VC world create a lot of the hype. And so I've got to I play a very delicate role there. But as an operator and a founder, no conversation escapes us without talking about AI, right? It's the reason why everybody here has come out tonight. So it's quite exciting, and there are some things that I'm sure we'll talk about later that keep us up at night, and as we think about them from a social perspective, ethical perspective, that also shouldn't be lost on us. It's a lot of responsibility for us to think about.
Great. Just in case people are shy, is there any questions yet? You always got to pop the first question, or should we just keep going?
We're trying to be respectful of your time, so you guys are giving us, your presence here. So feel free to ask any questions.
Yeah. Okay. You passed the 7-second rule. If there's no questions after 7 seconds, we'll move on. So there was a lot of great stuff there, a lot of stuff that I was thinking about. And we talked a lot about, we're kind of already getting into one of the main topics, which is, I think, a lot of the challenges I really would like to talk about. So maybe to just drill into it like a little bit, get your guys' individual thoughts on what you think are kind of some of the fundamental, be it or practical, technical limitations of really making significant progress using AI in biology. So yeah, if you want to lead us off, Gwen. Yeah.
So I think the only thing I would disagree with some VCs on is the importance of data. So I think for a lot of other fields, data is not the bottleneck anymore. But for a lot of different segments, subsectors of biology, data is. Compute, we don't need immediate second-by-second computation. We can actually wait overnight for the results, but we don't have enough data to improve our accuracy. And so I wasn't going to start a fight on stage on AlphaFold 3, but AlphaFold 3 does improve the confidence, so that's the PLDT, but that's an internally calculated confidence based on how much data it has. It's not accuracy, which those two things are different. Accuracy is compared against experimental data, which is cryo-EM, X-ray crystallography. So the confidence interval is not compared against experimental data. So I want to caution that, because when I talk to actual drug discovery people and folks that are in pharma, that's what they ask me. It's not what's your confidence interval, it's how does it compare to actual, whether it's cell line data or human data.
Great.
Yeah,
That's fine. That's a good point. But I do think that I do think there's good advancement in the field. That's the main point I was trying to make. Not that it's ready for prime time. We're going to get drugs tomorrow, but yeah, all of there is like if you think about it, they come out with these new models like every year. So it's a huge amount of improvement in 1 year. So I think that's impressive. But yeah, in terms of technological issues that we have with using AI. I kind of alluded to this, I guess we're just saying the same things. Data is a big issue. I come from the more so the diagnostic side, and getting good data from diagnostics is incredibly difficult. A lot of this data is not publicly available. Anything that looks even remotely publicly available probably still isn't relevant in terms of how exactly they collected it, the patient demographics. When you make a model, it needs to be the exact same patients that this model is going to be used on. So it can be very expensive to get that data. You can, in the United States, if you want to ask for clinical data from different types of hospitals and their for-profit organizations, we've been quoted sometimes like $700,000 to get like under 1,000 patients worth of data. It can be incredibly costly and difficult, and it's one of the big barriers. So yeah, for me, in my space, that is the biggest issue.
Okay.
Yeah, I think when I look at this, data, it always does come back to garbage in, garbage out, having the data you need to do complex biology, and biology is very, very complex. And when I make investments, often if you look across my computational biology portfolio, all my companies have wet labs, or they have some component of there are some experimental processes that need to happen. The data that they generate is also really critical in terms of where they source it, how they build it, is it synthetic, from what data sets are they pulling from, all the kind of points that were made earlier. The other thing I would stress, and this is the challenge in biology, it's every couple of years with the advancements of AI, it unlocks the predictive ability, but also the scope of subgroups of data sets that you can glean that before were really difficult to get. Now those are becoming much more accessible. Knowing how to apply AI and not just go on a fact-finding mission and then often leading to answers that don't actually translate well has been a huge issue. There are a number of companies. I have a stealth company I'm a co-founder at that is looking at translational models. And we think about this from a perspective of a lot of the hypotheses that ML models generate, they don't often translate. Why is that? How do we think about that? How do we generate new data? How do we generate new biology? And so I would say some of the bottlenecks here, there's been an openness over the years of many organizations, including pharma. So after I was in academia and I worked in the startup world, I also took the mantle of chief business officer at a few companies, and I've been working with pharma. And back when I started working with pharma, they had no idea how to work with startups. It's gotten a little bit better, but there's still this avenue of we need everybody to work together. And the big part of that excites me, that's still somewhat of a bottleneck, is making sure pharma and the larger companies play well with startups, making sure startups play well with those entities, and also for governments to play a role into all of this as well. You're seeing some nations leading the charge in opening up data banks and biobanks and finding ways so that startups can get access to that data. Because if we are going to solve it, to Gwen's point earlier, data is a bottleneck, and for us to get better and better at that, we need access to it. So a lot of that kind of comes down to this aspect of how we all work together as the models advance to make sure we know where to point them in terms of direction. And the only last comment I make, because I think there's a lot of people in here who probably are interested in the startup path, the best companies I've invested in weren't chasing the hype. They were chasing where the puck was moving, but they weren't too far ahead either. And one of the dangers you can have, especially with the biology side, you can make very bold claims of where the technology could be, where it really isn't today, and that could be a slippery slope of where a lot of companies fail, and so they don't live up to the hype. So you got to somehow time this in a good way, and there's no magic way. You got to find investors that also align with it, but that also comes back to timing and making sure that you have the data and the technology and the team to get you to where you're going. Yeah. Hopefully that triggers some questions. Oh, yes, we do have a question. So from my industry, wearing the industry hat, one of the bottlenecks is people see value in the data differently. I've often had conversations with execs at pharma companies who go, whoa, 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 data, we want that. And then you ask them, what is it that you actually want? Do you even know what this data says? Or they often don't know. And so a big conversation is around what is it that you're actually trying to accomplish with the data, and brokering the type of relationship so that both sides, especially those who hold the keys to quite a bit of the data, much of which could be clinical data, could be disease-specific data. Often foundations have access to these types of data, or they could be locked up in a clinical trial somewhere that's very bespoke to the area you're working in. Those two parties have to work together. So a lot of this is partnerships with industry. The data exists. Some of it still needs to be created, but you need synthetic data sets as well as the ones out there to be scraped and to work well with it. And often startups struggle to get access to that. So the only other aspect of that data that's limiting, having wet lab facilities and capabilities to generate and validate some of the data is another limiting factor. You can't just do that in silico. You do need some element of wet lab validation to help component to it. That's my 2 cents.
Gwen, did you have?
I'll answer the question I want to answer, which is how do you solve this data problem? So there's I think it's a nonprofit called Aligned to Innovate. It's funded by Erik Schmidt, and so they do see this data problem. So PDB is Protein Data Bank. It's from I think 30 years of a lot of different labs, right, contributing to the data. So it's the biggest protein data bank database that we have, right? And so the idea and that's what allowed AlphaFold to happen, right? Is it had data to train on. So what we realized is it'd be so valuable to society to have more of these open databases, right? And so there's an attempt to build this for other applications. I do think that a lot of data is going to stay siloed in pharma, from all of my interactions. And to their credit, they've paid millions, hundreds of millions for that data, right? And so rightfully so, they realize the value of that. And so I don't know how to solve that, but I think from the preclinical side, there are attempts to solve it.
Robert, do you have?
There's just some good points. There's different types of organizations that some of them are more willing to give data out, especially in Canada, if it comes from institutions that are publicly funded, if they just care about patient outcomes and they don't care about profits. There may be some of these organizations you can try and collaborate with, but it does take, it's still not easy though. But yeah, you have to just pick and choose where you want to try and get your data from.
I think I saw another question back there.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a swing at this. So I was the first investor in a company called Sakara. It's the modern biostack. It's the industry standard for anybody that ever wants to design or build data pipelines. It's the data orchestration tool that 1,000+ companies use. It's a world leader. I'm still on their board. I was there as their first investor, and I've seen that company scale. The unique thing about that company, and the reason I invested from day one, it had the largest open source community. And it was a very important thing to me from day one that we make sure no other investor tries to shift that, because I think that in itself is one of the most beautiful assets that has driven a major part of the success in that company. And I think the challenge people often have, and it's not an easy answer because I don't know AlphaFold's story innately because I'm not a part of it, but I would just say it's not always binary where you're either open source or you're not. And I think being creative and having the right set of investors and the right set of founders who value the open source community, the team values it innately as part of the culture there. We've continued to grow that open source community while also making sure that we run a business and that we generate money, and we found a way to balance that while not losing sight of the power that the open source community gives us. So I often do have these conversations with other founders where the discussion is, when do we turn off the open source community, and when do we become really profitable, and when do we turn that funnel? And I think it's the wrong conversation. I think for AI to get to where it needs to be, the open source nature of this, the collaborative nature of this is really integral to the advancements we're going to be making. It gets even more complicated from a geopolitical lens because there are certain nations that want to work with other nations and there's certain nations that don't. And then you introduce a whole range of other issues from a regulatory perspective, from other parameters. And these are all exciting things to think about, but it's going to be shaping everybody's lives and everything you work on. So that's how I would think about open source, but I'm very heavily biased and a huge champion of it, so I don't know if anybody else had opinions on it, but that's how I think about it.
Okay, great. I mean, just maybe, or did you have something to add?
Okay, so just being very technical here, AlphaFold, the training data, the training code is not public. The prediction code is public, right? So there's only so much you can tweak about the model. So just because a model calls itself open does not mean it's fully open.
Yeah, that is a good point. I kind of wanted to follow up on what we were mentioning about talking about how you were saying that like big pharma is not particularly open to data, and you're talking about keeping it open source. Like, is there a concern? I mean, I have my own opinions, but is pharma really going to want to play game, or they want to kind of gobble up this data? And are you worried that they're going to start trying to acquire companies to just kind of own the data? Or like, yeah, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I mean, my 2 cents on pharma, right? So, I've been advisor to big pharma companies. I've worked with big pharma. My companies, the ones I've operationally been a part of, and my portfolio has partnered with a number of pharma companies, the leading pharma companies. I would say there's a couple shifts happening in pharma. One, they have a very clear product of what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to get drugs into the market. That's their MO. And they're very good at that. What they're not often very strong in is the discovery phase. Many of the assets come from outside of pharma. This is just the nature of how things have always been. I would say that pharma has gotten much more sophisticated over the decade or so. I mean, I remember having conversations with pharma where they didn't have a single person who had any AI type of data science background. Now, the majority of these pharma companies have leaders in these roles. They have their own dedicated teams. That doesn't mean that they've been able to solve all their problems, and it presents other headaches with sometimes dealing with folks who think they can do things that other startups can do often much better, but they have dedicated resources now to this center that's doing it, and so it does pose other challenges, but I would say pharma has gotten much better at understanding how to partner, and startups have gotten a lot savvier too. There was a time when very candidly, pharma saw startups as, oh, this is like a CRO. We just go pay them. They give us, charge a fee, and then we take everything else with us. And now you're seeing startups, small companies. I mean, one of my companies, Inaugural, if you Google the deal that they just signed with a major pharma company, it's a significant deal. They're being taken seriously. And so I would say that pharma's getting smarter. They're realizing that these things are important. The deals are taking place. Are we there at a point where these collaborations and deals are streamlined and there's an easy playbook? No, but we are definitely making waves towards them, and they shouldn't be seen as a bad entity. We need them. We need pharma just as much as they need the startups, and everybody has to play well with each other. You just got to find the group that's willing to do it, and government plays the exact same. I see them the same way. You can see the FDA and regulatory as a barrier, or you can see them as a thought partner and work with them to kind of figure out how you think of diagnostics, how you think of new therapeutic development using in silico models. And so that's how I would position it. I know pharma's not the bad guy. You just got to figure out how to navigate it. It's not easy, but it's necessary.
Great. Any thoughts? Yeah, okay. So we're talking a lot about data and data kind of being one of the big issues. And I mean, it wouldn't really be an AI conference in Edmonton without mentioning Rich Sutton and kind of the bitter lesson, which is kind of this idea that most of the progress that's been made in AI has been a result of more data, bigger models, more compute. And that's kind of top of mind for me, especially in the biology field where acquiring data is hard. Even knowing if it's, quality data, what to make out of it, and then to really, when people think like, oh, like they play with ChatGPT and they're like, it's so fluid, and they get this feeling of like it really understands, which, well, we could get into that if we want, but are we going to be limited by having enough data with our current approaches to machine learning? Like, can we just, Sam Altman's, his biggest priority is building bigger computers. That's his plan, right? Can we even provide the amount of data that's necessary to make really big changes in biology? And if so, do we need to focus more on high throughput, high quality data acquisition? If you guys have any thoughts. Robert, do you want to?
Yeah, I think, it's amazing in healthcare space, we do have an enormous amount of data, but it's always so siloed off that it's a real problem. In Canada, there's a few governing bodies that own a lot of it because of healthcare, which is wonderful. But it would be wonderful if we had better leadership at top level that could make better processes to make this available to all those that need it, not just like companies, but also a lot of researchers within academia itself. They struggle as well. I just heard on a panel talk today at the AIMS event. There's some clinicians that generated data on some of their patients like a year ago, and they struggle to get it back just to do any type of analysis on the same patient again because of privacy rules and why are you using that data? So it can be quite challenging. We're doing a lot in Alberta to try and centralize our data with ConnectCare, which is wonderful. It may provide us with a lot of opportunities going forward. I think we just need a little bit more higher level governance and processes to figure out how can we actually make this data more actionable for all those that actually need it. But I think that the data is there. It's just figuring out how to get it.
Okay, so it's just there's enough data. We just need access to it.
And it's really difficult also because there's something else to think about. There's tons of data in Alberta that could be potentially obtainable. But if you want to make let's say an AI model in diagnostics, if you want to, depends on where you want to release it. If you just want to release it in Alberta, that's fine. You don't have to do external validations. But if you want to release this in the United States, now you're going to need data from the United States as well. And this is a whole separate beast. And how do you get that data? And so many different organizations and different types of hoops you have to jump through and different costs. And because you have to understand all these different structures for where you're going to try to get this data from, it becomes a very difficult challenge. You have to have specific people that are almost dedicated to trying to figure out where can you get data, where is it most cost effective. And it's quite challenging. But the data is there. We just have to figure out a good process to actually centralize this properly for everyone.
Right. So, you also need a team of people working with regulators, not just data scientists.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Yeah, what I'm seeing in the Bay Area and other geographies, to build an AI company these days, it does seem like if you're playing the compute game, it's extremely resource intensive. The ability to hire the talent is extremely difficult. Large companies are competing in the same way that startups are. I think there are different approaches to this. Exactly as Robert outlined, there's ways if you want to think of it from a focused priority lens of what kind of data you're getting. There are also a number of startups and geographies that are thinking of small language models, different parameters. It's not always about having the largest data set. That doesn't always translate to something that's great. It's the quality of the data that still is very critical and important. And often when I see the parameters that are being thought of, there's no shortage of data points you can get from biology. Anybody in the single cell world will know this, right? Like if you multi-layer single cell resolution or analysis, live cell imaging, I've got a number of companies looking in that world, and there's just no shortage of data, the data points you can glean. But it also just comes back down to fundamentally what it is, the application that you're trying to solve. And I often, like I see in any trend, building AI or building R&D shouldn't necessarily be the focus of startups these days. You're not going to outcompete somebody else's R&D budget. But what you do have a position to do is figure out a product or an application. And there's a number of them that don't require you to compete with somebody else on compute or the talent pool. And I think that is the way that the more thoughtful the founder is in their approach to this, they're able to navigate that. And my best companies have figured out how to navigate that, but there's a nuance there. And you just have to navigate this in a very thoughtful manner to think about.
Great. Gwen?
I'm going to say something controversial.
Nice.
So AI is more than just LLMs. And I know that OpenAI has taken over the world the last year and a half, 2 years of our lives. But that is one branch of AI. I think reinforcement learning is maybe 20% of that of what OpenAI uses. So reinforcement learning it's Alberta, right? It's Rich Sutton. So that's not the most of what OpenAI is using. So I really want to open people's eyes on just because one branch is really blooming doesn't mean the other branches have died, right? And so one thing that my company has done is lack of data is a problem, right? And so we were just talking in the green room that, we're just problem solvers. We're not, like software engineers, the really good ones, it's not about what language do you know, it's what problems can you solve. It's a way of thinking. So we've been so far, knock on wood, we've been able to solve problems, just the data problem by just being smarter about it, right? And so I won't go into details, but so far we've been able to bridge that gap. At some point, we're gonna have to generate our own data, but so far, so good.
Okay, great. We got a question.
On that point, it sounds like, we've been talking about the bottlenecks in data. It sounds pretty unanimous that it's a challenge. It seems like not much is changing on the accessibility side of the data, right? Universities are wising up to the value of it. They're going to want something. Pharma has in-house teams, right? And so it seems like the logical next step is in-house generated data, right? Maybe starting with some sort of model and then having some sort of high-throughput way of generating your own wet lab data. How do you see that as kind of the future of data generation? And I guess it does speak to the point of finding a niche that you're working on and that you can really generate a strong data set in there. But do you see that as a strong future in this data bottleneck problem that everybody's talking that you all have been talking about?
Is this to me or to all of us?
I mean, the whole panel, frankly.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there are two ways to solve the data problem, right? And the solutions are for different types of problems. So one way to solve it is you need a lot of data for one single niche. Then yes, use robotic, generate as much data as possible. But there's another problem where you need tangential data. So the analogy I use for my sister who's not in AI is think about impressionism painting. You don't want to keep painting that one dot, right? You want to paint next to it. That forms a real painting. And so those are two different problems using two different solutions.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would add to that is that it is not uncommon, and often it's my advice to some of the early companies I invest in, to get wet labs as soon as possible and to start generating your own way from a high throughput perspective to be able to scale up. Often when you look at companies in this space, my bigger worry is that sometimes signaling is the founders or maybe their investors are putting too much focus on signaling. They try to adapt based on, I have this all the time where they go, well, I think this VC wants me to do this, or I think pharma wants me to do this, or academia wants me to do this. At the end of the day, the fundamentals of building a good company don't change. And you need to position this not necessarily in a way of what other companies have been doing, but what works for your company and the data sets that you need to get to the goals that you're trying to go to. And fundamentally, you need products. You need to figure out what you're building towards and work backwards towards that. And often the challenge I see from many of my peers in the VC community, the knee-jerk or quick reaction to many startups that they're building are, okay, well, go get a pipeline and start building assets. And most of these teams that they're investing in, not a single one of them has a drug background. None of them are drug hunters. And the feedback they get is often reminiscent of some other companies, maybe the first generation or second generation they've gone through. And it's almost like a quick answer to, well, we need to do something. And the reaction we have is, this is what's happening with pharma. This is what's happening with academia. We need a pipeline. Get to the pipeline as fast as possible and start getting towards an indication in therapeutic area. And I still think there's tons of untapped potential from real platforms and real platforms in bio that have applications that are tools or high throughput screening technologies and methodologies. That there's tons of value there. And a number of my companies are infrastructure plays. So they don't necessarily, their product isn't a drug. It could be, but I think sometimes we're too quick to answer those questions. So the other caution I give for the folks in the room, this playbook changes so rapidly, it's often best not to try to follow another company's playbook. And a good example is, Tempus is IPOing, and you can go read their filing, and it's quite interesting to see what Tempus is doing now versus what they were doing. And there's certain things here that you can glean from what others have done, and they may not be the playbook you need to follow, or that you may gain inspiration from a different way to do it.
Great.
I'll just add that biotechnology is obviously a very big field. If you do have the ability to have your own wet lab and based on what you're trying to do, make your own data, that's absolutely wonderful. And obviously in other areas like diagnostics, where you're doing with healthcare, it obviously becomes much more difficult to make your own data if you don't have have a hospital or something like that backing you.
And that, I think that's kind of perfect. My follow-up was thinking about how important or useful is generating, say, synthetic data from these data sets. Will that help get around some of the privacy issues, and how useful is it in general?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. Some people really like the idea of using synthetic data. I'm a bit, it's certainly better than nothing, absolutely. But it's never as good as the real thing. Right. So you have to be careful with it. Also, depending on how do you make the synthetic data? Are you using something super basic and it's not actually giving you that much information? Are you using something that's super complicated and just trying to get all those nonlinear patterns? And then you have a higher risk of actually leaking some actual patient data or whatever data it is if it's privacy sensitive. So you do have to be a bit careful with it. From my own work on it, I've always not had good results with synthetic data, but that's just my own personal experiences. But if that's the only data you're going to get and it's the only way we're going to be able to share data, I'm all for it.
Right, great. Did you have any thoughts on synthetic data? No, okay, great. So I mean, kind of while we're talking about this kind of issues, I think thinking about regulatory concerns is pretty important too for the space and the rate of progress. I recently learned about Eroom's law, which is just Moore's law spelled backwards, which applies to the FDA. So, which states that every 9 years, the FDA approves half as many drugs per $1 billion spent, which is a pretty significant trend, I think. So, I'm wondering, even if, say, AI produces all the technological miracles we could imagine it does, it says, like, here's, even though clearly we're not making a lot of brand new drugs despite promises, say it does that, will that matter? Like, is it much more working with regulators and the FDA to like speed up this whole kind of pipeline?
Maybe I'll weigh in an interesting way, because my position on this has changed over the years. So I initially was extremely jaded about the regulatory process in the US. So when I was a founder, when I was a scientist, I always thought it was really burdensome. And there are many components of it that still to this day are. But I would say, having worked closely now with regulatory officials for most of my career, there are a lot of hardworking folks that really want to see the same outcomes that everybody in this room wants to see. And oftentimes, they're not given enough credit, and there is so much importance to what they do, because you don't want AI in biology, unlike other fields where, if I need AI to generate a poem, maybe the poem has some spelling mistakes or is, contextually not right. We definitely don't want drugs to be made that did not go through the right regulatory systems and hurdles. So we definitely want these checks and balances, and these checks and balances are really important. In January, I was approached by ARPA-H, which is the new U.S. funding agency. So I've joined in helping and supporting their activities. And this is an initiative that has a couple $2 billion behind it. It's a new U.S. funding agency. It's all about moonshots and helping us think about, from a U.S. lens, as well as globally into Canada and other agencies, how do we really move the needle, and how do we make sure government works closely with startups and industry? And every time I've ever spoken to an official over there at any level, they love talking to folks from industry who have real concrete experiences. This is what they need. And I'm sure it's the same for your local government. And you may meet people who are the legacy people that have no interest in changing things. They're not the right people for you to speak with. Just like with investors, everybody comes in different flavors. And so my advice would also be, from a regulatory perspective, if we're to see any of the changes we want to see, we need to be working closely with regulatory. And there's actually quite a bit of emergence with even how we think of, for example, can we use organ models? Can we use other translational models? The FDA has come forward with new approaches to thinking about that, as opposed to the legacy way of just using mice. So there is development. It is a question of how closely can you work with them. You should definitely not ignore regulatory. And I almost push every founder of mine, regardless of how early stage they are, to think about their regulatory journey and how they navigate it. It's critical and important. It's a good validation metric for how they think about it.
Well, Gwen or Robert, any thoughts on?
I'll just add that there's a lot of cost, obviously, with developing drugs in many different types of stages. So AI, I think, maybe like if it works out perfectly the way we want it to, it may be able to help us have higher probability of more quickly getting drugs going to clinical trials that, let's say they are more successful, and that's a good thing. If there's less clinical trials that are happening because they're more successful, that'll help decrease costs in that regards. But we also have to remember that it's just a very intrinsically expensive process. To get one patient inside of a clinical trial, depending on the trial itself, can cost $10,000 or sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. And especially in the United States, they are not cheap. Those for-profit hospitals want their money. And as you get drugs that are trying to be, better than the last generation, our current drugs, for in many cases, are very good. So if you're going to make an improvement, it may not be a very big improvement. So if you have small effects that you're expecting to see in a clinical trial, you need to power that appropriately with even more patients to see that small effect. Right. And with the patients being so expensive, it becomes a lot of money, and that problem specifically won't be solved by AI. So it depends on the type of drug we're dealing with. But in theory, it may help reduce some costs, but probably not as much as we'd like.
Right. And I mean, you.
I'm not turning this into a FDA is not so evil panel, but I've always been a science nerd. I took every STEM course possible because I thought, I can learn history when I'm retired and old. But the older I've gotten, the more I learn history, the more I'm appreciating the value of the FDA. Because sorry that we're only talking about the FDA. I know nothing about outside of the U.S. In terms of regulatory. One country regulatory concerns are enough. But the FDA single-handedly stopped thalidomide from coming into the U.S., right? Like, there's a reason why we have the FDA. So despite how much we'll complain about the cost of it, it is absolutely necessary. I also, I'm beginning to appreciate how resource limited they are, right? They are backlogged. And I think the other thing is, so I did have a chance to ask Robert Califf, who is the deputy commissioner of FDA. No, actually, the commissioner, not deputy. And I was questioning him on why there are not more therapies approved for a particular area of a disease. And he pushed back at me. He said, "You give me a validated T-cell model, I'll start approving them," right? And so I had never thought about it that way. They're not in the business of developing these models. We have to give it to them. So that totally changed my mindset. I'm trying to work with a nonprofit to start developing more of these models. But if any folks are actually in research, this is a great area to work on.
By the way, just one quick thing on, I don't know much about the Canadian regulatory environment, but some of my companies who are US-based actually work with the Canadian regulatory environment for diabetes, for other types of conditions. There are some areas, there's trade-offs to every major regulatory environment, but Canada, surprisingly, there are a number of areas that you guys are extremely strong in that even US companies will work with Health Canada and then get the type of work they need to do with the FDA in the US. So there's also this geopolitical nature of this as well, where the FDA is a nice standard, but a lot of clinical trials are being done in other countries that the FDA is happy with. I mean, there is a global movement in this as well, where it didn't really exist 20, 30 years ago as well. So there is some other innovations happening in that regard too.
Yeah, and I was even just thinking while we're talking, I mean, I don't know what your guys' opinion are. There's kind of the standard statistic of something like 90% of clinical trials fail and take 10 years and crazy amounts of money. And I was like, is that, given the huge failure rate, it probably makes the FDA extremely conservative and gun shy. So is it possible if AI actually is able to make better predictions of how effective a certain target will be or whatnot, do you think that might change the very conservative, like they're more likely to kind of fast track things more so because there's a higher success rate, or? Yeah, go ahead.
I think our expression kind of told the answer to the question, actually.
Yeah. I've had some dealings with the FDA, more on the diagnostic side, and I feel like their attitude is always going to be focused on these are the metrics we care about, you have to hit these metrics, and less about what's happened in the past for success rates. That's just my opinion.
I think it's a good thing. Like I have a good buddy over there, and he doesn't care how shiny the object that comes in is. If you hit the KPIs or the metrics, and the things that they're looking for, and you've got the validation they're looking for, that's what they care about. They don't care about the fancy name, the fancy VCs behind it, how much money you've raised or haven't raised. They really do genuinely care about the data, which is what we want them to care about. And so you should never lower these standards. If anything, I think it introduces a new set of parameters to think about, and they have expertise. And if they don't, we should be encouraging collaboration to work with them to develop new parameters and new expertise. But you should never lose the fundamentals of biology and how science and how medicine is developed. There are much better ways of solving the problem that you described that fundamentally don't have to do with the drugs themselves, but perhaps how they're manufactured, how clinical trials are conducted, site management, all things that AI have a huge role to play. Automation, organization, orchestration, all of which have nothing to do with touching the drug, but have everything to do with supply chain and many of the other concerns where I think AI has a huge role to play.
Right, like even having some experience thinking about just doing GMP manufacturing, the amount of companies that just like pen and paper logs, you're just asking for errors and mistakes. So even just streamlining that kind of data flow is, I think, probably make a huge difference. Yeah, did you have anything else to add? Yeah, okay. Maybe I wanted to just, question.
Yeah, so in biology there's a lot of variability in the data, and we're talking about a lot of stakeholders here making big data, and that's siloing into, hopefully, at the end of the day, a large data set. But do you think there's enough standards in place to kind of prevent that reproducibility? Because we're talking about using AI models to fast track things, but if it's bad data in, we're going to get all these kooky errors at the end. So do you think there's enough going on in that space?
I think it's very domain specific, right? So the PDB is very good at, this is the standard, all of our files are in .pdb, right? But clinical data is notoriously messy. Sorry, not clinical, but patient data, right? Is, this hospital codes something differently from that hospital. You guys use Celsius, we use Fahrenheit. It's just, I would say, this part of data hasn't changed, which is probably if you're playing with data, 80% of your cost is going to be cleaning and labeling the data. So that, unfortunately, I would love OpenAI to solve that, but I don't think it's been solved yet.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that it's fairly easy to figure out if you have different data sets. It does take some time and effort to merge them and harmonize different data sets. Another thing that you really need to think about for healthcare data, for laboratory test results, if that's what you're trying to standardize and use as features for your models, is that you have to really be careful on which lab tests, where they come from. So what we've realized from PSA tests and free PSA tests that we were interested in our product for Clarity DX Prostate, when looking at external quality controls where they have Bio-Rad has a very specific set of serum they pull from different people, and they give this out to all these different laboratories around the world. And they say, okay, tell us the results that you got from the exact same sample. And they do a whole bunch of tests on these. And so what we found is for some of the tests total PSA, which is our main screening tool for prostate cancer, depending on what instrument it comes from, it can range roughly 15-20%. And that wasn't even the worst of it. When we looked at free PSA, it can range 60% from Roche devices to Abbott devices. And this is the exact same sample run on different machines. And regardless of how you standardize the data output, and if it comes out in nanograms per milliliter, you still have to worry about that data being completely different because of the instrument. And trying to get the data of what instrument all these lab tests came from, that's a huge issue. So that's something that surprised us quite a bit and something you really have to take into account.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said. The only thing I'd add is this is a wonderful area for very smart people to think about. Standardization across the board is going to be so critical and fundamental for how we move forward in this space. And so from every disease space to how hospitals work and interwork and the interoperability there, everything else, these are those things where it's always interesting to me when I meet with founders and they chase after these really sexy problems or what gets the headlines. This is not probably one of them that's going to get the headlines, but it is often the best ones to build towards because they can have such a demonstrative impact on everybody's life. And I think it's a wonderful area for very smart people to think about, and it's it's a huge necessity for us to see. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to agree. Coming from a physics background, biology. Oh, yeah, very quick. I learned the hard truth that in biology, 80% is 100%, which was hard to swallow, but it is a very real thing that we have to think about when building all these AI models. Sorry, you saw a question somewhere? Yeah, perfect.
So there's a little bit of a nuance here, right? So when you say the big companies are getting bigger, the foundation models are getting bigger, right? So I don't advertise. I don't recommend anyone to try to compete with OpenAI or Anthropic. They have way too much money and way too much compute. It's too hard, right? And Google's in that race as well. And yes, we talked about how pharma is hoarding all the clinical data, but it really is niche dependent, right? Pharma is not working in every modality. So it's where are you picking your spots? And so to my earlier analogy on impressionism, not every dot is painted on that painting yet in terms of data, in terms of biology, right? If you're talking about social media or that type of data, yes, Facebook has a huge head start. I don't recommend you to try to hoard data in that area either. However, if you have a particular niche, such as a particular type of news and whatnot, you might be able to build something there as well.
Yeah, and it's an interesting, almost moral question too, on how we see culturally how these, how the environment is shaping with these larger companies and roll-ups and smaller acquisitions. There was a period of time, even in the Bay Area, where I would have friends who were their quick thought was, I just need to build something really quick to sell to Twitter or Google, and make a quick change on it in a couple of years. And there was this environment, and we are somewhat in that environment where large companies have the cash to buy these smaller companies, and you're seeing a lot of that. But often, I would challenge everything that Gwen said. I would agree with in terms of how you think of the areas and the moats, the data moats they're creating at these larger companies shouldn't be ones that you're going to go and compete against. The best companies I invest in often don't have much competition in the spaces they're in, and they're creating markets or creating new value that these larger companies haven't even thought existed, because also the fundamental approach is usually different from how these larger companies work, and they're not as agile to change and to this is the benefit of being a startup and a smaller entity. The one other thing I would say culturally or socially, and how you think of personalities of founders, when I work with my founders, I really try my best to get to know them, and I try not to invest in a founder who's trying to sell to a big company. That's their end goal, cannot be that. That's not my MO for investing. I want companies that stand the test of time, have legacy built into them, and have a North Star of impacting humanity in a way, either human or planetary health, that is demonstrative, and it's the 1 in a million opportunity that somebody wants to build. That's why they're building, not to sell to a big tech company. That can't be the outcome. Otherwise, I think you're going to always fall short of those goals. So if you're ever thinking of starting a company and you're seeing that, I think you should just know there are many companies not selling, and those are often the very exciting ones to why they're not. because there's often no number attached to it, and they really do believe the North Star they can create by themselves. Large companies have their own challenges too. There are trade-offs on both sides. So it goes back to the first comment I make. The last thing I'd say on this point is that we are at an era where either the incumbents reinvent themselves and win the race, and there's a lot of hype over the foundational models they're building and some of the things that they're strong in, but they also have tremendous trade-offs. And there are very brilliant people building startups, high-growth companies, some stealth companies, and that is the era. It's either the startups win or the incumbents win, and I think everybody has a place in this roadmap, and countries also, and it just goes back to those fundamentals. Yeah.
Great.
I'm good with those answers.
Okay. I believe we're at 8 o'clock. Do we have more time, or is that time? Okay, so is that the end?
Maybe we can take one last question.
Who's got the burning question? This is the most important question. Let's see. The Canadian crowd is shy.
Oh, all right.
Oh.
Right there.
It's a question about niche markets and rare diseases. So you've been talking about finding that unique space. But do you think AI fundamentally changes the rare disease opportunity, or is it a data quantity issue? Foundations often have deep, high-quality data and are more willing to share. So how do you think AI is impacting that whole cycle?
Okay, so I did work with a startup that was focused on rare diseases, and the way they gather data is exactly like you said, is partnering with, there are patient groups for these rare diseases, and they're very tight-knit groups, and it's usually a foundation, it's usually a nonprofit that can contribute both data and money, right? And so it's a fantastic partner. I would say the only thing that's changed the last 18 months is the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA. What we've learned is a lot of big pharma is shying away from sort of orphan diseases or rare diseases, and it's because in the previous regime, right, it was still profitable because you can accelerate drug approval, and so therefore it's profitable that way. But they're realizing that the TAM, basically the market for the drug is too small. Another startup that I worked with, the disease was so rare that their clinical trial had already cured half of the population with that disease, right? And so, you've just shrunk your TAM by half.
Great.
Maybe just add a little bit that because it is not a great amount of profit that you can make off of it, it's likely going to end up those people who just want to help solve the problem but don't care about the profit. They'll be working on these types of solutions. And maybe AI can help them if it just helps them make predictive models easier than before we had those such tools. But it is a difficult issue.
Yeah, and maybe the one last thing I'd say here. So I'm modality and therapeutic agnostic. So I have a portfolio that includes rare disease-focused companies. There's one working on Rett syndrome, other rare diseases. And I think the AI approach that they have gives them a unique advantage. It's a great place to everything that Gwen just said about how you can work with these foundations. I think the playbook to how they think of their business model needs to just be evolved and thought of differently than the traditional immuno-onc plays or some of the other large population models. The TAM is small, but I've always thought of this, it's always fascinating when people even some VCs that I meet with, they go, well, the TAM's too small, we'll just come back to us, or it's a different pitch, we're looking for big TAMs. And I often find that's also the wrong outlook too. Rare disease is one of the most unique aspects because I've had some of my companies backed by people whose loved ones have been touched. And often you can find a high net worth individual or somebody wealthy that does care about the disease population that you're focused on, or a foundation. And so I almost feel like the approach or the playbook to rare disease is slightly different, and you just have to think about it different. And there are other companies that then build pipelines because the technology they built is platform-based, and they can now focus on other areas that will get them the financing, but they never lose sight of the rare disease element. It's a very near and dear issue to me because there's a number of my companies that focus on rare diseases, and I'm very lucky they're doing well, but they've had to come up with a very different playbook. So as always, this is the exciting part of why everybody is in this room. The playbooks aren't written. You guys are literally writing them. And it is the most exciting time to be thinking about startup world. That would be my encouragement as opposed to just joining a large company. But the point being, if you work on these really exciting problems, this is where I'm thrilled to see where the next few years kind of takes us. It's all going to change, and this panel will be very different in 5 years because the advancements will be different too.
Great. I think we'll close on that. I just want to give one closing comment. First of all, thanks so much. I think it was a great discussion. If anything, I felt I learned a lot, and it kind of changed my mind as to why AI and bio is actually exciting. It's not for the reasons I thought, and kind of in an ironic twist, it's because that space is much like biology itself. It is very diverse in branching, and to quote kind of my hero, I think there's just lots of room at the bottom, to quote Richard Feynman. So thanks so much. Give a round of applause to our panelists.
Now, one small last favor. Before flying out here, I had my neighbor ask me, why are you going to Edmonton? Is there really an ecosystem there for you to speak to? And so I would love to take a selfie with us and this as an audience to share with him and on LinkedIn. So if you all will just stay there for a second, let's do this. This is still a thing in the Bay Area, right? So let's do this.
Great.
There we go, ready? What's up, Milad's friends? I like it. Well, there you go. Thanks, guys. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think we're done, yeah.
Sorry. Oh, you can steal the mics.
Just one more quick thing before we... Sorry. My bad. I was just going to also say thank you to MNP and Edmonton Global. And then we have a QR code that we're going to throw up here on the screen if you guys want to stay involved for other events that we're going to be hosting throughout the year, want to get involved in helping host the events, want to support as a mentor or maybe meet some of the mentors, or you're thinking of spinning off a company, just scan the QR code. It's a really simple form. Fill it out, please, and we'll get back to you.
Cool. Yeah, and if you're a student, if you want to be a potential advisor for Nucleate, a potential mentor, please come talk to us. I'm Lucas. This is Dan. And mingle. Thanks so much, guys.